Welcome to St Giles for this talk on Dante. It's my great pleasure to introduce David Bell, who's very interesting. He's a medieval linguist, I suppose you could call this, at the languages faculty. And I think we're in for yet another treat, so please welcome him. David.
Can everyone hear me all right? Is the microphone doing its job? No, not terribly well. If I speak like this, is that better? Yeah? Okay. Good afternoon. Thank you very much for coming out on what is a pretty grim day. I work on medieval Italian literature, on Dante and his forebears, and today I'll be talking to you about Dante, poet, mystic. I've left an either-or slash there because that's one of the questions I want to talk about a bit today, and it's a somewhat vexed question. Dante Alighieri is known to us as the author of one of the greatest works in the Western canon, the Divine Comedy, the Commedia, a 3-book, 100-canto poem describing a vision of the afterlife comprising the Inferno, the Purgatorio, and Paradiso. The Christian epic has been the focus of concentrated study and commentary since its completion in 1321, and Dante scholars are still no closer to fully unravelling some of its enigmas, and are, if anything, further away from agreeing about even the most famous and frequently discussed episodes. In Oxford today, and around the country and around the world, research is still ongoing to unpick the significance of Paolo and Francesca, of Virgil, of Beatrice. Why has this text chimed for readers down the ages? Why does it continue to trouble us with its representation of the afterlife? Why can't we get over Dante's poetry? And I, for one, hope we never do. These questions are all related to the one I'm posing today, and can perhaps all be brought together under one more seemingly straightforward question. Who is Dante? As you already suspect, while there is one simple answer to this question, there are many very complex ones. But I'd like to start with the simple one, and then think about some of the complexities, and maybe even dare to suggest some answers to them later. Dante was the author of a large number of poems, treatises, and of course, the Divine Comedy. He was born in Florence in 1265, between the 21st of May and the 21st of June. He was a Gemini. And it's a great pleasure to be able to talk to you about him in this significant birthday year. His parents were a Guelph moneylender called Alighiero di Bellincione and his wife, Bella. Despite his family's mercantile activities, Dante always claimed nobility for his family, and would in fact engage in a lengthy spat with his brother-in-law, Forese Donati, over these claims. Of course, Dante's arguments with the in-laws had to take the form of a series of sonnets, the poetic form invented in Italy in the 1200s and made famous in England by Surrey, Spenser, and Shakespeare. Dante and Forese used the exquisite poetic technique to call each other fat, greedy, cheap, and illegitimate. Now, where there's a brother-in-law, there's a wife. And when Dante was 12, he was contracted to marry Gemma Donati, with whom he would have a daughter, Antonia, who would become a nun, taking the name Sister Beatrice, and at least 2 sons, Jacopo and Pietro, both of whom would later write commentaries to their father's epic poem. There may have been a 3rd son, Giovanni, we're not quite sure. Once Dante got famous, a lot of people claimed descent, basically. However, Gemma Donati is not the woman we associate with Dante. Instead, it's his love for Beatrice, most likely the Florentine noblewoman Bice Portinari, which is celebrated in his poetry and remembered by history. In keeping with the traditions of courtly love poetry, Dante's literary focus was on a woman to whom he was not married, indeed, who was married to somebody else, but to whom he nonetheless swore fealty and undying love, praising her in the majority of his poetry, in his Divine Comedy, and transforming her in his Divine Comedy from courtly beloved to divine messenger, celestial being, and image of Christ. Dante was also active in the civic life of 13th century Florence. He was of the Guelph party, ostensibly opposed to the Holy Roman Emperor and supporting the Pope against the Ghibellines, who were pro-imperial. But Dante's own stance was distinctly more complicated than such categories imply. His political career and convictions put him on the wrong side of Pope Boniface VIII, and various factional machinations led him to be exiled from his native Florence in 1301, never to return. So, who is Dante? A poet, a visionary, a literary genius, a devout Christian, a devout lover, a man concerned with his immortality, both spiritual and historical. Those of us studying Dante in Italian faculties and literature departments can sometimes forget just how visionary Dante's text is. We can get lost in the Divine Comedy as poetry, as beautiful, complex verse, laden with imagery, cultural references, quotations, and rhetorical flair. We get so entangled in the fabric of Dante's narrative poem, following every thread, reading the warp and weft of the thing, that we lose sight of the overall work, the tapestry of vision and revelation which Dante claims to be communicating to his readers. There have been a couple of notable exceptions to this trend. The Italian scholar Bruno Nardi's 1941 essay, Dante Profeta, Dante the Prophet, and Columbia professor Teodolin de Barolini's 1992 book, The Undivine Comedy, which, despite what the title may imply, actually begins with an acceptance of Dante's text as part of the visionary tradition. Attempts to claim Dante as a mystical or visionary writer are not straightforward, though. One of the contributing factors to this tendency among interested academics to discuss Dante's work as something more essentially literary rather than something visionary is Dante's work itself. Not only his comedy, but his other texts, all of which coexist in a carefully constructed network of interdependence. Put another way, one of the most enthusiastic readers, quoters, and interpreters of Dante is Dante. It is Dante's own literary and indeed social and political awareness which sometimes divert us from discussing him in visionary or prophetic terms. But before letting such diversions take hold, I'd like to think about Dante as mystic, or at least as mystical in his writing. By mystical, I'm referring in broad terms to the possession of a spiritual character or significance by virtue of a connection or union with God which transcends human understanding. An OED definition which seems to account well for most other definitions and discussions I've come across. I'm also referring to something more specifically related to the tradition of mystical theology, of the sort we associate with figures like St. Bernard of Clairvaux and Teresa of Avila. I mention Bernard in particular because he makes an appearance in Dante's Divine Comedy, guiding the figure of Dante through the final stages of his pilgrim's progress towards a vision of divine light in the last cantos of Paradiso. But more of that in a little while. Let me first discuss those visionary aspects of the comedy which necessarily point us towards a mystical tradition. Dante presents his poem as an articulation of revealed truth, as the narrative of a true vision of the afterlife during which he, as a pilgrim still inhabiting his earthly body, travels through the three realms of the Catholic otherworld, encountering the souls of the damned in hell, the penitent in purgatory, and the blessed in heaven. During this journey, he's guided by three souls. First by Virgil, the classical poet he most revered, calling him at one point his teacher and author, maestro e autore. Then by Beatrice, his beloved and the focus of his earthly love poetry. And finally, by St. Bernard. This journey begins with a moment of coming to from sleepiness, which has been read as indicative of a dream state, a visionary moment. Nel mezzo del cammin di nostra vita, you'll find that this is the first quotation in your handout. Mi ritrovai per una selva oscura. I'll carry on in English and I'll read the longer quotations. I'll read the quotations today in English, but the Italian is available on the handouts. Midway in the journey of our life, I came to myself in a dark wood, for the straight way was lost. Ah, how hard it is to tell the nature of that wood, savage, dense and harsh. The very thought of it renews my fear. It is so bitter, death is hardly more so. But, to set forth the good I found, I will recount the other things I saw. How I came there, I cannot really tell. I was so full of sleep when I forsook the one true way. Dante then goes on to compare himself, albeit negatively, with two of the great afterlife travellers of classical literature and biblical history respectively, Virgil's Aeneas and St. Paul. When Dante the Pilgrim utters the words "Io non Enea, io non Paolo sono," I am not Aeneas, I am not Paul, he draws a parallel between his journey and Aeneas' descent in the underworld, narrated in Book 6 of the Aeneid, and also with the episode in 2 Corinthians known as Paul's rapture, the mystical seizing up into heaven of the soul, or perhaps soul and body, of an unnamed man, already widely understood by medieval commentators to be Paul himself. And here I quote Corinthians, 2 Corinthians 12, 2-4. I know a man in Christ who, 14 years ago, was caught up to the third heaven. Whether it was in the body or out of the body, I do not know. God knows. And I know that this man, whether in the body or apart from the body, I do not know, but God knows, was caught up to paradise and heard inexpressible things, things that no one is permitted to tell. Inexpressibility is an important part of what Dante does in the Divine Comedy, the inexpressible nature of what he sees. But it's only part of what he does. Clearly, the inability to recount something would be problematic if you're writing an epic poem. So he tells us quite a lot. And as we shall see over the course of the poem, Dante is neither of these men, neither Aeneas nor Paul, because he's like both of them, and then some. He will descend into hell, guided by the Aeneid's author, and ascend the mountain of purgatory, before Beatrice and then Bernard take the reins to guide Dante through paradise. And while Paul in 2 Corinthians is unsure on whether soul and body alone, soul alone, or body and soul together, were carried up to the heights of paradise, Dante is absolutely clear that his flesh travelled with his soul through the realms of the afterlife. In Inferno 23, he tells a pair of friars from Bologna who have been condemned for their hypocrisy. In the great city by the fair river Arno, I was born and raised. I am here in the body that was always mine. And then later in Purgatory, the souls he encounters are shocked by the shadow his form casts on the ground. As in Canto 3, the second quotation here on the slide. As soon as those in front could see the light upon the ground was broken to my right, so that my shadow stretched up to the cliff. They stopped, drew back a little. To which Virgil responds, "Non vi meravigliate, don't be amazed, but think that not without a power sent from heaven does he attempt to scale this rocky wall, the cliffs of purgatory." In this encounter with the marvelling souls, though, it's also made clear who the true force behind Dante's voyage is. It is the power sent from heaven, the divine will, which allows this marvellous voyage to take place. In this sense, there is always a second author behind Dante's poem, God himself, the grantor of the grace which is given credit for Dante's pilgrimage through the afterlife. This grace is emphasised at a number of key moments in the narrative when Dante, or Virgil on his behalf, effaces his own role in the undertaking of the journey. One of these moments plays out in the 6th circle of hell, when Dante tells a damned soul that "da me stesso non vengo," I do not come here by my own power. Another is to be found in the 1st canto of Purgatory, when Virgil echoes "da me non venni," to explain that he guides Dante because of a donna scesa dal cielo, a lady descended from heaven. This admission of the divine grace which moves their journey onward gives Dante and his guide access to the second realm, the mountain of purgatory. As Dante and Virgil ascend the mountain, the surprise of the souls they encounter at Dante's shadow, cast by the human flesh he still wears, serves to reinforce this, the great surprise of the Commedia. Our pilgrim, traversing the spaces of the afterlife in his earthly body, is an outstanding exception to all of the rules governing life and death. His whole journey is an exceptional one, and it's only able to take place not through the strength of his own will, he tells us, not through the power of his genius, but through the intervening, freely given grace of God, administered by Beatrice at first through Virgil, and later directly, when she takes over as Dante's guide. The motive power of this grace is reinforced when St. Lucy carries the sleeping Dante to the gates of purgatory from the shores below. St. Lucy is a very important saint for Dante. He took her as a kind of patron, a personal patron saint. She was the saint of the blind and the saint of vision. And this is obviously important for the visionary aspects of the comedy. These operations have grace to the idea of a mystical Dante, a man granted some sort of visionary experience not of his own making, one seized up, often literally, by his guides. In addition to Lucy's intervention, Virgil physically carries Dante on a number of occasions. Indeed, this experience of the other world, this experience of the other world sometimes defies representation. In the Heights of Paradise, Dante tells us that his sacred poem has to jump. And so, in representing paradise, the sacred poem must make its leap across, as does a man who finds his path cut off. The text has to break the bounds of normal representation in the face of the challenges of a celestial experience which blocks normal literary channels. And the possibility for poetic expression completely breaks down in the final mystical vision of the poem, in which Dante will come to contemplate the Trinity and stare into the alta luce, the exalted light of the highest beauty, sommo piacere. This final vision is characterized as revelatory and enrapturing, as all-absorbing and transcendent. And this mystical moment is facilitated by one of the great mystics from Dante's relatively recent history. Bernard of Clairvaux, 1090 to 1153, that would have been a truly impressive feat, canonized by Pope Alexander III in 1174, 90 years before Dante's birth, needs little introduction. The first Cistercian entered onto the calendar of saints. Bernard was as politically active as he was theologically significant. A key figure in the work to resolve the schismatic division of support between Pope Innocent VII and the anti-Pope Innocent II and the anti-Pope Anacletus II. He was also the official voice of the Second Crusade, commissioned to preach it throughout Europe. These roles would not have been irrelevant to the significance of Bernard for Dante, who was himself forcefully pro-crusade and in favour of a church with united spiritual control, sitting alongside a Holy Roman Empire with united temporal control. It is, however, the theology and Mariology of the mystical Bernard which comes to the fore in the closing cantos of Paradiso. It should be noted at this point that Bernard's arrival on the narrative scene is something of a surprise, hard to explain for Dante in the comedy, for the Dante writing the comedy, and for those of us reading Dante's comedy. The whole purpose of the poem, of the vision recounted within it, has seemingly been to lead Dante back to his beloved Beatrice, transfigured into an agent of grace, and through her to St. Lucy and the Virgin Mary, and then God. From the very beginning of the Inferno, when Virgil tells Dante that he has been sent by Beatrice, who was in turn stirred to intervene by St. Lucy, who was herself prompted to act by Mary, there has been an expectation that this chain of intercessors would be repeated in the Heights of Paradise. Or, given the dramatic reunion with Beatrice at the top of the mountain of Purgatory, perhaps that Beatrice herself would lead Dante to the heights of his visionary experience. Dante's surprise at the arrival of Bernard is palpable. I expected one thing, and here I've given you one thing on the left with Dante and Beatrice, but found another. And here we have the other on the right. These are from the Egerton manuscript at the British Library. Instead of Beatrice, an old man, adorned as were the rest of those in glory, met my eyes. So another Beatrice is replaced with the saintly Bernard. But Bernard is not immediately or even rapidly identified, remaining anonymous for 44 lines after his appearance in place of Beatrice at Dante's side. Yet, having arrived so unexpectedly, Bernard becomes crucial to the fabric of the comedy in its closing stages. His mystical importance to Dante is made clear in the description of Bernard as him who, still within the confines of this world, that is our terrestrial sphere, in contemplation tasted of that peace, the peace of heaven, the contrast there between questo mondo and quella pace. It is the contemplative ecstasy achieved by Bernard while still on earth, which makes him the perfect companion for the protagonist's final moments in paradise. And, fittingly, Bernard's will be the first voice we hear in an extended passage at the start of Canto 33, the final one in Dante's poem, with an extensive prayer to the Virgin Mary. And you'll find extracts from this prayer on the handouts in front of you, the second and third quotations. This is the only original prayer in the Divine Comedy, in the sense that it's the only prayer which does not translate, rework, or partially report prayers in common use in the liturgy of Dante's Italy. It is, however, reminiscent of various of Bernard's Marian writings, and so the voice of Bernard sounds authentically present in Dante's poem. Virgin Mother, daughter of your Son, more humble and exalted than any other creature, fixed goal of the eternal plain, you are the one who so ennobled human nature that he, who made it first, did not disdain to make himself of its own making. In this prayer, Bernard exhorts the Virgin Mary to aid Dante in fully experiencing the vision of the divine, asking that his mere humanity does not impair his mystical experience. This man who, from within the deepest pit the universe contains, up to these heights has seen the disembodied spirits one by one, now begs you, by your grace, to grant such power that by lifting up his eyes, he may rise higher towards his ultimate salvation. And I, this is Bernard speaking, who never burned for my own seeing more than I now burn for his, that is Dante's, offer all my prayers and pray that they may not fall short, so that your prayers disperse on his behalf all clouds of his mortality, and let the highest beauty be displayed to him. This intercession for transcendence may be enough to grant Dante's vision, but it is not sufficient to allow the poet to report his experience. Even as Dante recounts the marvels he has seen, he accounts for the failure of language to express that which he has undergone. So I thought we had these on the next slide, so I will now read them out in full. Ormai sarà più corta mia favella, pur quel ch'io ricordo, che d'una fante che bagna ancora la lingua alla mamella. Now my words will come far short of what I still remember, like a babe's who at his mother's breast still wets his tongue. And again, just out of order. And again, oh how scant is speech, too weak to frame my thoughts, compared to what I still recall, my words are faint. To call them little is to praise them much. So this is just a return to Bernard, indicating Mary to Dante. If you'll forgive me, I will delay somewhat the gratification of Dante's closing lines to throw a slight spanner in the works of the mystical Dante whom I've been presenting to you thus far. I do this not out of gratuitous cruelty, but because I can't bring myself to quote those closing lines and then to start off on a different tangent. So here's the tangent, and the rest will follow. I mentioned at the outset that claiming Dante as a straightforwardly mystical writer was not uncomplicated. Indeed, just the other day, a new book on gaps in literature called Lacuna was being presented across the road at the Taylor Institution, in which the failure of representation that I've just been talking about, and which I'm offering here as evidence of the failure of earthly language to articulate mystical experience, something of the inexpressibility of the vision that Paul describes in Corinthians, is instead viewed as a calculated rhetorical choice. In the opinion of that scholar, Dante's omissions in the heights of paradise are part of a strategic effort at realism, an attempt to make the narrative more realistic by insisting on the inexpressibility of the subject matter. Even back in the visionary heights of Paradiso, it's difficult to completely discount the art, the artifice of the comedy, and the poetic verve of its author. At this point, then, I wish to introduce some of the complications that necessarily come to the fore when thinking about Dante as a mystic, all of which are summed up in the other term of my title today, poet. In Dante's case, I feel the need to try and pronounce a capital P at the start of poet, to somehow convey the canonical authority which Dante so carefully crafted for himself throughout his literary career. From his two poetic compendia, the Vita Nuova, the New Life, and his Convivio, the Banquet, to his Latin treatises, the De Vulgare Eloquentia, on eloquence in the vernacular, and the Monarchia, on monarchy, which was about the role of the Holy Roman Empire. Dante was consistently concerned with authority, linguistic authority, Latin versus the vernacular, political authority, the emperor versus the pope, and literary authority, Dante versus the rest of the world. I won't go into detail on the minor works today, but I will briefly recall that in Dante's Vita Nuova, his New Life, the poet collected a series of his own poems and placed them within a framing narrative which represented an idealised account of his poetic development and his burgeoning inspirational and salvific love for Beatrice. This account leaves off after Beatrice's death, Dante's brief loss of faith in her memory and the reinstatement of his fidelity to her through a miraculous vision of Beatrice enthroned in heaven. Dante finishes that little book, as he calls it, a libello, with a resolution to say no more about this blessed one until I would be capable of writing about her in a nobler way. The Divine Comedy presents itself as that nobler writing. When Dante, having been led through hell and purgatory, encounters Beatrice once again in the earthly paradise at the top of the mountain of purgatory, she chastises him for his infidelities and reminds him of the love he owed her and of his vacillations after her death. He recalls the ancient flame, l'antica fiamma, of their love and begins to praise once more her beauty. But this is by no means the only moment when the literary past comes back to haunt the comedy. And I'm not just referring to Dante's own literary past. From the outset, classical literature and Dante's own literary milieu, the other poets operating at the same time and slightly before him, play an important part in the fabric of the poem. The most significant classical point of reference is, of course, the work of Virgil, Dante's guide, and particularly the narrative of Aeneas' descent into the underworld in Aeneid Book 6. But also other parts of Virgil's epic, as well as Virgil's eclogues, particularly Eclogue 4, which was constantly misread in the medieval context as being somehow a prediction of the coming of Christ by a pagan. So Virgil always got a bit of a rough deal of it because he ended up being consigned to hell or being consigned to limbo because he was a pagan, but having still managed to somehow predict the coming of Christ. It's actually about Octavius, but well, this is what happens. This is how Dante is encountering the eclogue in this particular context. And also, as you recall, Aeneas is one of Dante's points of comparison, along with the Apostle Paul, at the start of the otherworldly journey in Inferno. Dante also quotes, among others, Lucan, Ovid, the late antique poet Statius, as well as many others, far too many to count. Seneca, Cicero, Aristotle, albeit in a Latin translation. And the level of his engagement with and appropriation of this textual history contributes to his own self-establishment as something of a big deal in the world of poetry. Indeed, when Dante is guided into limbo, he is welcomed by Homer, Horace, Ovid, and Lucan, and included, along with Virgil, as the sixth member of a bella scuola, a fair school of great poets. Of course, Dante distinguishes himself as the author of a Christian epic from these pagan poets by not being trapped with them in limbo, because pagans, no matter how virtuous, are stuck in this, placed in this kind of this static space, this pretty unpleasant but not quite as painful as the rest of hell space within Dante's Inferno. Moves like this make it hard to disentangle the visionary aspects of Dante's enterprise from the self-serving and the literary. Similarly, when Dante encounters Paolo and Francesca among the carnal sinners in Inferno, Francesca's speech is dotted with quotations from the works of Dante's contemporaries, like Guido Cavalcanti, and his recent forebears, like Guido Guinizelli, warning of the dangers of medieval love poetry, which lacks the sort of salvific, theological, Christological orientation offered by Beatrice. Dante will even meet the souls of some of his departed fellow poets in purgatory, where they cleanse their sins of gluttony and lust. When Dante meets the soul of Bonagiunta, That poet, who had little trouble with the poetic innovations of Dante's immediate predecessor Bonicelli, comes out firmly in favour of Dante's new poetry in a passage that is as famous as it is debated. And this you'll find on the second page of your handout. But tell me if I see before me the one who brought forth those new rhymes, begun with ladies that have intelligence of love, donne che avete intelletto d'amore. And I said to him, I am one who, when love inspires me, takes note, and as he dictates deep within me, so I set forth. Oh, my brother, he said, now I understand the knot that kept the notary, Guittone, and me on this side of the sweet new style I hear. Guittone was another very influential poet in 13th century Italy, and the notary is Giacomo da Lentini, a Sicilian poet who is credited with inventing the sonnet. Leaving aside the generations-long debate on what precisely the sweet new style, the dolce stil novo, is, who it includes, and what its limits are, one thing we can say with certainty is that this episode paints Dante's writing in a very positive light. The soul of another poet, acknowledging the novelty and value of Dante's poetry, beginning with that poem, Donne che avete intelletto d'amore, ladies that have intelligence or understanding of love, which was itself the centerpiece of his Vita Nuova, his new life. So again, this kind of constant self-quotation, self-referencing, self-explanation. And even in Paradise, Dante's poetic ambition is articulated in actually what I find a rather poignant moment, when he's coming to terms with his exile and with the scope of his project. And this is the quotation beginning, Se mai continga che il poema sacro, al quale ho posto mano e cielo e terra, sì che m'ha fatto per molti anni macro, vinca la crudeltà che fuor mi serve del bello vile, io dormia, agnello, and I'll carry on reading in English. Should it ever come to pass that this sacred poem, to which both heaven and earth have set their hand, so that it has made me lean for many years, should overcome the cruelty that locks me out of the fair sheepfold where I slept as a lamb, foe of the wolves at war with it. With another voice then, with another fleece, shall I return a poet, ritornerò poeta, and at the font where I was baptized, take the laurel crown, for there I came into the faith that recommends the soul to God, and now, because of it, Peter encircled thus my crown. A little context. Dante, the protagonist, has just been taken through a celestial catechism by St. Peter, and it is in this moment, after having been kind of applauded for his catechistic ability, that he interrupts the poet, the voice of the poet rather than the protagonist, interrupts to address his own state, his suffering, his endeavour, and his vain hopes for a triumphant return to Florence. This is both a bold statement of poetic ambition and an acknowledgement of the tribulations which Dante is experiencing on earth, the conditions of his exile, the unlikelihood of his ever being allowed back to the city of his birth, and baptism. In these lines, Dante claims that his poet is divinely inspired, that it is the product, his poem is divinely inspired, that it is the product of both heavenly and earthly powers, but he also claims that it is deserving of the laurel crown, the pinnacle of worldly poetic achievement and authority. This literary ambition and the claim of literary agency and art, which goes hand in hand with it, needs must make it a little difficult to claim that Dante is working in the same vein as Bernard, Bonaventure, Julian of Norwich, or Teresa of Avila. This is not, however, to discount the importance of the mystical in Dante, or indeed to Dante. So, having taken stock in small part of Dante's poetical nature, I want to return to those last lines of Paradiso that I have delayed quoting until now. Dante's text is at all times literary, frequently mystical, and transcendentally beautiful. And never is this truer than in the final passage of his comedy, in which his accomplished imagery, his formal exactitude, his religious conviction, and his visionary tone come together in some of the most enduring lines in the poem. And I'm going to read these through in English, and I'm then going to read them through in Italian, just because I really like them. And this is the final quotation. Like the geometer who fully applies himself to square the circle, and, for all his thought, cannot discover the principle he lacks, such was I at that strange new sight. I tried to see how the image fit the circle, and how it found its where, but my wings had not sufficed for that, had not my mind been struck by a bolt of lightning that granted what I asked. Here my exalted vision lost its power, but now my will and my desire, like wheels revolving with an even motion, were turning the love that moves the sun and all the other stars. Qual è il geometra che tutto s'affigge per misurare al cerchio e non ritrova, pensando, quel principio onde egli indige? Tal era io a quella vista nuova, veder voleva come si convenne l'imago al cerchio e come vi si indova, ma non eran da ciò le proprie penne, se non che la mia mente fu percossa da un fulgore in che sua voglia venne, all'alta fantasia cui mancò possa, ma già volgeva il mio desiderio e il velle, sì come rota, ch'igualmente è mossa, l'amor che muove il sole e le altre stelle. In preparing this talk, I came across a 1947 article by Walter J. Ong, whose title, Wit and Mystery, I might well have borrowed / stolen, had I found it sooner. In it, Ong is primarily concerned with medieval Latin hymnody, but in his introductory remarks, he says something that struck me as profound, and with which I'd like to finish today. Here, Christian teaching does more than merely supply the matter for poetry, and more than merely suggest an architectonic framework for literature, such as one often finds remarked in Dante or Milton. Rather, at the point to which the trail of wit leads, the very texture of poetry itself, the element which makes literature literature, is seen to come into functional contact with the heart of Christian doctrine, the mysteries distinctive of Christianity, as these lie in their own distinctive way within the human mind. So, it is often the trail of wit that we are wont to follow in our textual encounters with Dante. And there is still much work to be done, indeed being done, on the functional contact of doctrine and poetry, on the mysteries of Dante's great poem. Thank you.
If you would like to make a comment or ask a question, please put your hand up so I can come and let you have the benefit of the microphone.
I'm just wondering about the music aspect.
Yeah.
Because the mindset at the time was very much like this anyway. It's almost as though the Divine Comedy was just like a literary altarpiece in my eyes, with all the people that obviously the contemporaries of Dante, contemporary beliefs at the time. And I just see it as a visual, a literary altarpiece with his just playing out, actually, the beliefs of the time, John Church, the world. So the mystic aspects, they're there, I believe, but I think it was very much part of the mindset. I don't know if that's correct or...
There are a couple of responses to that, I guess. One of which would be, in some sense, yes, in the same sense that an altarpiece could be, let's say, a maestà by Giotto, could be sat there and people could be contemplating it, and that could be treated as a doorway to mystical experience in the sense of contemplation leading to divine presence, and that the function of objects of worship within a kind of mystical practice. Then yes, it is perhaps part of the mindset, but also perhaps to an exceptional degree, which presents itself as much more than I am contemplating, because he could have written a poem contemplating an icon, and indeed I have a colleague in the audience today who's done a lot on icons and poetry related to it, so maybe she can jump in at some point with an answer. No? Okay. So he's undergoing what he's consistently claiming to be a full visionary experience, which is couched in terms which are drawing on the visionary tradition, the tradition of visionary writing, on the writings of people like Bernard, and the writings of on Paul's experience in the commentary tradition that grew up around Paul's rapture in 2 Corinthians. There's also the aspect which he's not entirely of the mindset of his peers. So he is often innovative and quite radical in his representation of theology, in his attitude towards the church and his attitude towards the structuring of the afterlife. So he's someone who always comes across as having a very profound religious conviction, but one which sometimes flies in the face of what is accepted as the norm. So, for example, just the presence of the virtuous pagans in purgatory is entirely of his own making. That's Dante's innovation. His particular attitude towards excommunication. He encounters a host of excommunicated souls on the shores of purgatory who, despite being excommunicated, are still present because of the strength of their individual faith. And so he's presenting all these things which, and indeed his treatment of some particular characters, like the way he has another damned soul predict the arrival of Boniface VIII in hell, where he's treading on very dangerous ground. But is presenting it as... Now, and there are two ways of looking at it. Either that he's presenting it as revealed truth to give himself a get-out-of-jail-free card, or that he genuinely believes there's something revelatory about this experience, and so he's fearlessly recounting potentially dangerous things, and indeed condemning friends and mentors to hell, and family members to hell, and also exalting people who he disagreed with in life to purgatory, to paradise. Because there's some level of either underlying belief or the sense of a necessity to tell this narrative. Now, whether that necessity comes from, whether it comes from narcissistic drive, or whether it comes from divine intervention, that's debated, that's questioned, that's a major part of the difficulty or the argument that's encompassed in that little kind of dividing forward slash. So he's both radical, but also, in some senses, yes, perhaps is fulfilling a similar relationship to his work of art. His work of art is fulfilling a similar function to an icon, to an artist.
Exceptionally,
yeah.
Strong.
Yeah.
That's similar, obviously, to artists with the mindset at the time to.
Yeah. No. Absolutely. Thank you. There's a question in the back.
Thank you. I'm curious about the language. How different is Dante's Italian from modern Italian? In other words, can someone knows modern Italian read Dante as compared to, say, us trying to Chaucer?
The comparison I tend to make is it's more like us reading Shakespeare than us reading Chaucer. So it is distant, it's notably distant. It's a lot less distant if you're a native of Florence or Tuscany, because actually aspects of the dialect are still very much more similar to the language that Dante is using, because he's using a version of the Florentine dialect, which isn't necessarily that rarefied at times. There's a lot of kind of vernacular language, and there are things, for example, instead of saying vado for I go, he says vo, and that's still typical of Florentine and Tuscan dialect. But there is a distance, there is a linguistic distance, and so Italians reading Dante for the first time in high school often have editions with paraphrases, and part of the process of learning it will be to paraphrase into modern Italian. And also there's just the problem of syntax as well, because the complexity of his rhyme scheme, of his terza rima, with these interlocking rhymes, means that he has to sometimes push his syntax in all sorts of interesting ways, which can then make following a sentence a little bit difficult, especially when you've got the added aspect of that kind of linguistic distance. But unlike people like Petrarch and Boccaccio, whose works were very much taken as a basis for constructing a new literary Italian, Dante was slightly sidelined because he was much more ready to embrace kind of loan vernacular rather than kind of higher literary registers. Whereas other poets and other writers, people like Petrarch and Boccaccio, were very much drawing on Latin structures in writing, and so making it more kind of refined, and that became part of the standardized language.
This question is very strange, actually. I'm just wondering about when Dante was writing the Divine Comedy during his exile, how good his diet was. I'm just thinking of other sort of people like St. Catherine, and it's said about sort of perhaps St. Catherine, the anorexia, and the heightened state of, I don't know, more prone to sort of having visions. So therefore I wonder, with Dante, has he not been in the same situation at times?
He does tell us in that passage I gave, the Se mai contenga, from Paradiso 25, he does say that the writing of the poem has made him macro, lean, thin. That said, he does also at another point complain about having to eat the salt of another man's bread, because he was a good Florentine and you don't have salt in your bread in Florence. Tuscan bread doesn't have salt in it. So he was very bitter about having to eat the salt of another man's bread. But he was getting fed. He was staying with people and moving around from house to house and being kind of fed and watered. So I don't know how far his macro is a genuine statement that he's been undernourished or the stress has worn him down, or how far it's a kind of emphatic, slightly hyperbolic statement in his own personal state.
Was Dante or the Commedia ever really regarded as genuinely visionary?
It is by some. Basically, it has been treated. The earliest commentators immediately tried to turn it into an allegory. So they went straight in for giving an allegorical explanation of everything. Because if it's an allegory, then it's kind of sanitized from the potential perils of it actually being visionary. And this is what the work of people like Bruno Nardi and Ferdinando Barolini is really interested in, is actually kind of moving away. That's what the de-theologizing is, the undivine in Barolini's undivine comedy. It's precisely stripping away this tendency to allegorize, to actually try and look at what the text is claiming to be, which is a visionary text, and how that makes us read it differently to if we're just constantly peeling away the layers of the allegory, or stacking on the layers of the allegory. So the early commentary tradition definitely very much reads it as allegorical rather than visionary.
How did the popularity of the Divine Comedy grow and expand?
It was pretty popular for a long time, and it wasn't very popular in the 17th century, and then it was quite popular again, basically. It was widely copied in the early days, and we find fragments of it cropping up in manuscript compendia, in the ledgers of the Commune of Bologna, very soon after it was written, because it was being circulated in parts. So it wasn't that he wrote the whole thing and then the whole thing got, so it was being circulated in cantiche, in books. And so the Inferno was in circulation before the Paradiso was finished. And so we have fragments from very early on in its history, very soon after its writing, cropping up where people have clearly remembered it or read it or heard it and have scribbled it down somewhere in their clerical ledger as a kind of point of reference. Or actually, they often use fragments of poetry to mark the end of a contract. So in the same way we would cross through a check, they had a sonnet, which I think I prefer as a method. Might make it a little bit difficult for the automatic machines to read them. This is a check for £120, and my love is like a red rose. But we also then have people like Petrarch says that he doesn't value writing in the vernacular as much as he values Latin writing. So we're talking shortly afterwards, Petrarch born in 1304. So he was 17 when Dante died. Saying he didn't want to pursue vernacular writing in Italian rather than Latin so much, although he did loads of it, because he didn't want his words to be being recited in the streets by ruffians, like Dante's were. So Dante's texts were known and they were spread, and people were copying them and learning them and reciting them from a very early stage. And there's a famous collection of Dante manuscripts called the Cento Dante, the 100 Dantes, which were apparently, the story goes, all prepared by one scribe to be sold to provide dowries for his daughters. It was being copied very widely very early on, and then it gets. Chaucer was aware of it. He translates bits of it. Chaucer translates bits of Dante, Boccaccio, and Petrarch, and it crops up then around Europe. It's perhaps more popular than it is in England. It really comes back into the English imagination around the time of the Romantics, because people like Blake, obviously currently being exhibited in the Ashmolean, provided illustrations for illustrated the Divine Comedy, and then you had people like Dante Gabriel Rossetti translating Dante's poetry, and then you have a huge burst of translations happening from the early 19th century. People like Tennyson are quoting and referring to Dante as well. So it becomes incredibly popular in England in the late 18th and the 19th centuries. But then also people like Botticelli did illustrations for the Divine Comedy. So it's getting pretty star treatment in Italy as well for a long time.
Well, it looks as if that's it, but I want to thank you for your scholarship, your erudite presentation, which was extremely enjoyable. And thank you very much, David.
Thank you very much.